Hello everyone, in this video we will discuss the third part of Hayden White's essay, Historical Text as Literary Artifact. First of all, let's read the text. Now, it is obvious that conflation of mythic and historical consciousness will offend some historians and disturb those literary theorists whose conception of literature presupposes a radical opposition of history to fiction or of fact to fancy. As Northrop Frye has remarked, in a sense the historical is the opposite of the mythical, and to tell the historian that what gives shape to his book is a myth would sound to him vaguely insulting. Yet Frye himself grants that when a historian's scheme gets to certain point of comprehensiveness, it becomes mythical in shape, and so approaches the poetic in its structure. He even speaks of different kinds of historical myths, romantic myths, based on a quest or pilgrimage to a city of God or classless society, comic, myths of progress through evolution or revolution, tragic, myths of decline and fall, like the works of Gibbon and Spengler, and ironic myths of recurrence or casual catastrophe. But Frye appears to believe that these myths are operative only in such victims of what might be called the poetic fallacy, as Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Spengler, Toynbee, and Sartre, historians whose fascination with the constructive capacity of human thought has deadened their responsibility to the found data. The historian works inductively, he says, collecting his facts and trying to avoid any informing patterns except those he sees or is honestly convinced he sees in the facts themselves. He does not work from a unifying form as the poet does, but toward it, and it therefore follows that the historian, like any writer of discursive prose, is to be judged by the myth of what he says or by the adequacy of his verbal reproduction of his external model, whether that external model be the actions of past men or the historian's own thought about such actions. So this passage continues Hayden White's argument that historical writing is not purely objective or scientific, but shaped by narrative and mythic structures. And now he anticipates the resistance this view might provoke among historians and literary theorists alike. Now let us study this paragraph in detail. First heading: The problem, myth versus history. White begins by acknowledging that comparing historical narratives to myths will likely offend many traditional historians. Historians often see themselves as truth-tellers, grounded in fact and evidence. To say that their work resembles myth, a form of story often associated with fantasy, legend, or unprovable belief, can sound like an insult. It seems to equate serious scholarship with mere storytelling. Similarly, many literary theorists also uphold a sharp division between fiction and non-fiction, or imagination and fact. For them, history and literature are opposites. One deals with what happened, the other with what could happen. So merging these two modes of consciousness, mythic and historical, challenges the foundational assumptions of both disciplines. Second heading: Northrop Frye's contribution. To deepen this discussion, White brings in Northrop Frye, a major literary theorist who has made important observations about myth and narrative. Frye himself notes that, in principle, myth and history are opposites. He even admits that calling a historian's work mythical might offend them. But And here's the twist. Fry also concedes that when a historian's vision becomes broad and sweeping enough, it begins to resemble myth in structure. That is, when a historian isn't just describing small events but trying to explain grand patterns across time, they often fall into narrative archetypes, quests, declines, rebirths, catastrophes. These are the very shapes of myth and literature. Next heading: Types of historical myths. Fry identifies several types of historical myths that frequently appear in big picture historical writing. First, romantic myths. These are based on quests or journeys towards some kind of utopia, like a city of God or a classless society. Think of Marx's vision of history moving toward communism. Second, comic myths. These reflect progress, often through evolution or revolution, where things get better over time. Third, tragic myths. These focus on decline and fall, like the works of Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West. And fourth one, ironic myths. These are skeptical or cynical, emphasizing repetition, random catastrophe, or the idea that things never truly change. Think of historical narratives that dwell on endless cycles of war or failure. So even though Fry tries to keep myth and history separate, he acknowledges that many respected historians actually write myth-shaped histories, sometimes without realizing it. Fourth heading: Fry's criticism of poetic historians. However, Fry draws a line. He criticizes thinkers like Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Spengler, Toynbee and Sartre. Why? Because in his view, they were so captivated by the creative power of human thought that they imposed large poetic patterns onto history at the expense of factual accuracy. For Fry, these writers fall into what he calls the poetic fallacy. They treat history too much like a novel or a philosophical idea and too little like a record of real events. He insists that the proper historian works inductively. That means the historian starts with the facts, gathers evidence from documents, artifacts, testimonies, and only then begins to see patterns. The historian, according to Fry, does not begin with a unifying vision, as a poet might. Instead, the historian moves toward a tentative understanding, one that is always checked against the available evidence. In this view, the historian's job is to reproduce or represent reality faithfully, not to invent or impose patterns. The historian is judged not by elegance or creativity, but by truthfulness, by how accurately their words reflect the external world, whether that means the actions of people in the past or the historian's own interpretation of those actions. Next heading: White's implied challenge. Although Hayden White is quoting Fry here, he is also gently challenging him. White doesn't deny that good historians care about truth and evidence, but he wants us to notice that despite their best intentions, even the most rigorous historians end up shaping their work into narrative forms, and those forms often resemble the myths we find in literature. So, when a historian writes a tragic story of national collapse or a comic tale of revolutionary success, they aren't just recording facts. They are structuring history through a particular lens, using familiar narrative tropes to give it meaning. This doesn't make their work false, But it does mean that history is never just neutral reporting. It is always to some extent constructed, and that construction follows literary rules as much as logical or scientific ones. And now conclusion. Many scholars are uncomfortable with comparing history to myth or fiction. Northrop Frye acknowledges that large-scale historical narratives often take on mythic forms: romantic, comic, tragic and ironic. He believes responsible historians avoid imposing these structures and work inductively from the evidence. Hayden White, however, suggests that even when historians try to avoid it, their work often follows narrative patterns that resemble those in literature. Therefore, historical writing is not only a record of facts, it is also a verbal construction, shaped by the same storytelling impulses that govern literature. So this was the third part of Hayden White's essay, Historical Text as Literary Artifact. We will meet in the next video and discuss its next part. Until then, goodbye and thank you.